Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jake and choir. And just singing that song, and as I mentioned, kind of a kid's song, but as I've gotten older, it seems like some of those little truths that we think are children's truths become even more important in life. One of the psychologists I listen to a lot says, well, one of the main things you can do in your life is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. I mean, that's kind of like you teach their kids. But a lot of us don't do that in our lives, and we become so surrounded by our own story, we don't even see that we're doing that. That's just a simple thing, one of the commandments, and it's just true. So a lot of blessings, which leads us into milk and honey. I'm going to talk a little bit about milk and honey. We've heard a lot about that. It's in the Bible, and it's actually introduced back in the book of Joshua. For some context, and we went through the story, so we've been reminded of this, but the Israelites fled. They were about 400 years, best we know. They were slaves in Egypt, okay? And then they wandered in the desert. Now, apparently, from what we know, their stay was extended in the desert. Why? Because they complained, they deliberately disobeyed God, and they turned to other idols. Now, of course, none of us in this world would have that problem. None of us would turn away from God. None of us would have, maybe we do every once in a while. So some of those Old Testament stories come back around, don't they? We look in the world. But I think it's important because it's so easy to pick on the world. And as I've gotten older, the sin around me seems even more dramatic. But then sometimes in doing that, I take myself off the hook. It's like, it's so bad over there, I forget about John Cross, who has his own issues to deal with. So yes, it's important to look out, but God always wants us to look inside for us. Nevertheless, God made a promise that they would not stay in the desert forever, and he'd bring them out of Egypt in Exodus 3:8, into the wilderness, into a land flowing with what? With milk and honey. Milk and honey. So that's kind of our theme today. Why honey? It's mentioned in other parts of the Bible. And here's a couple places where the Bible mentions milk and honey. Exodus 3:8. So I've come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, recently, there have been a couple people in our church who went to that land. Jake and Gina, I'll embarrass you, and you're not going to stand up and give a talk, but maybe sometime you could share. I've never been there, but everybody who has said it has a very deep impact on them, and I'm guessing for Jake and Gina. How many of you have been to the Holy Land? A couple of you out there have. You too. And come on, Roberta. Your hand's behind Jerry's head there. I know in talking to Duran before he passed, so yeah, that Roberta, she used to have to drag me out on these trips, but I kind of got liking them, and that one he especially liked. So Leviticus 20:24, hence I said to you, you are to possess their land, and I will give it to you to possess it, to a land flowing with milk and honey. In Numbers 14:8, if the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and will give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Now, those aren't the only references, but those are some key ones. So we think about this promised land. So what is it? It was a land this was actually, the promise came way back in Genesis when God made that promise to Abraham. The land of Canaan was reserved by God for his people, for the nation of Israel to grow and thrive in, with the exception if they failed to obey his commands. And when we went through the story, it was a little disheartening for me to think about it, but there were a lot of times when they failed to obey his commands. Moses is going up to get the commandments and comes back down. They're already worshiping false idols. Didn't take very long. Most of us know the story of Joshua and Jericho. That goes to Joshua 6. And when Israel finally finishes their 40 years of wandering the desert, they come to the promised land, but they find there's another group of people already there. But Scripture seems to assert that this land was for the Israelites it stood out from all the rest. Abundance of resources. Everybody from the land drank from rainwater, and rains tended to mean divine blessings from God. I know around here, living in a country that gets 12, 13 inches a year, 14, anybody connected with farming sees rain as a great blessing. Last year we had a particularly blessed time. We keep praying for more rain, of course. So we think about milk and honey. I was reading as I was preparing for the sermon, there was an archaeological dig around 2007, and they actually found some beehive colonies dating back to the 9th and 10th centuries BC in the Jericho area. So apparently they actually had bees there and honey, so that was somewhat literal and somewhat of a historical. And then we know that milk was often connected to fertility. So the milk could point to the abundance of the land, to delight, to joy, to sweetness, etc., which all brings us to the present time. Now, I was listening to a gentleman who talked about world and not just politics, but just the geography. One of the blessings of the United States of America is we have some of the best land for growing in the world. One of the things that really surprised me, and I might have mentioned this before, we have around 13,000 miles of navigable rivers in this country. That's about as much as the whole rest of the world combined. How much you think having navigable rivers has helped? We know from the Columbia River, the Snake River. I grew up not far from the Ohio River. I have a good friend, the one I went biking with, Mississippi River. That's part of the blessings of this land. There's really no place in the world kind of like our Midwest we're growing. And I don't know if there's any place quite like the Palouse, where somehow we just barely have enough rain to grow that wheat and be the #1 wheat producing county, plus we're able to grow cattle and other things. One of the connections that I want to make here is between milk and honey and gratitude, because what happened in the Bible and what I see in my life is that when we have milk and honey, when we have blessings, us tend to think, well, we get used to it. You know, show me more. It was nice today. What have you done for me today, God? That kind of a thing. So I was reading one good quote on gratitude. It's like faith. Or gratitude is like muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it grows. And often when we're grateful, we become even more grateful. I've known people whose lives are really, really full of gratitude. It seems like they just grow in that. Conversely, I've known people who tend to be, on the grouchy side, and then they keep getting grouchier. It tends to build momentum either way you want to go. But one of the things the Israelites showed us, we think about milk and honey, they escaped captivity, which was good, right? But then where did they go? They didn't go directly from captivity to the promised land. What was in between? The desert. And when I think about that, I think personally, there are times in our lives where maybe God delivered us from something, whether personal, family, an addiction, or whatever it might be, or just something we've gone through. And we think, oh, everything's good now. But then we look around, it's like, we're in the desert. What do you do in the desert? What God calls us to do is obey in the desert. Even though they only had manna to eat, they didn't have the meat. They said, we'll be slaves again. At least we had better food back there. At least we had, we had some beef and lamb. And out here we just have this manna. And so God calls us. We go from captivity. Sometimes we end up in the desert. How do we live in the desert? We live there in obedience. Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. Gratitude turns what we have into enough. It turns denial into acceptance. Gratitude turns chaos into order. It turns a stranger into a friend. I've known many people, say in my generation, who have a lot, say physically a lot more than I, but when I talk to them, their whole life is full of question and doubts and what ifs, very little gratitude and more question. I really should have had more. And I think that's kind of a natural thing. However, we have, when I met Shanette and, met her family, when you grow up, you don't think about, next week or what I'm going to do. You think about what you're going to have to eat tonight. And then what we're going to have tomorrow, it's kind of day by day, meal by meal. That's the way a lot of the world has worked. So, going through the lessons then that Patty read in Deuteronomy 26, and that shows that milk and honey are gratitude. That causes us to want to give fruits. For example, it says there, when you've entered the land, take some of the first fruits of that and give to the Lord. So in other words, we get the milk and honey, and then in thanks we give a portion of that to God. Another part of that was the tithing. It's like God gives us everything, we give a little bit back to God. God gives us all the bounty, we give a little back. But what happens sometimes? Well, God gives us everything. Well, maybe I'm just going to give a little less to God. Maybe I'll go from 10% to 8%. Well, I need a little more, to 6 to 5 to 4 to nothing. That's the way a lot of people do. But anyway, later on it says, then you and the Levites and the foreigners residing among you shall rejoice, and God has given to you all these things in your household. John Kennedy once says, as we express our gratitude, we must never forget that the highest appreciation is not to utter the words, but to live by them, to live a life of gratitude. This last couple weeks I was gone, as you know, and it's great to see the family, by the way. My son's doing so good, and got to see him and his lady friend Bree, who many of you met, and they're doing really good. I think they're going to come up here this summer. They can both work at home. I mean, she works for Charles Schwab, so she's like answers the phone, and my son, by the way, was impressed by her internet speed. I said, out here in Mud Flat? Yeah, he said, this is plenty fast, Dad. I can play my games online, so that's good, you know, we're all right out here. And when I see someone like him who's struggled some with life, with anxiety, but he's just so grateful now that he's found love, and he's growing. You know, you go from 20 to 30, you usually grow up, and it just made me feel so happy. And at the other end of that, of course, my daughter Adrian, 4 kids. I don't know how she does it. She's teaching now full-time Spanish in junior high, and the one they adopted, little Micah, is almost 4, but he is cared for. They have child care during the day for him. During the day, I just hung out, so the lady watching over him, they'd get by at noon, and Mike would come over and give me a hug. He's just a sweet little kid. Unlike Bentley, when Bentley was 4, if you left him alone for 2 or 3 seconds, most of the pans were out on the floor. The kids, you know, Mike is sitting there reading a book, you know. It's very different. The 3 older kids are all in swim lessons, so I was able to go and watch them swim, and it's kind of fun. But definitely felt land of milk and honey there, even in the desert. You know, that's the desert where they live. They live near a beautiful place called Sabino Canyon. And nestled in between there, I did this wedding that I'd mentioned to you, and Randy and Marie, they watch us, hello. And they gave me, as part of the wedding, this little store or whatever, Norge. He's Norwegian, by the way, so there you go. So I thought I'd put this here. And I thought of those two, without getting into detail. Randy's dear wife had passed away, natural causes, a couple years ago, and he wasn't doing real well as a widower. And his now wife, her husband had died 15 years ago, and she never thought she'd find love again. They kind of knew each other from 40 years ago. You know, they lived in the same town. Randy said I actually introduced them 43 years ago, although they were happily married to someone else, so they kind of knew each other's friends. So I'll take a little credit for all these years later. Sadly, they both lost a spouse, and they're together. But when I saw them, and the wedding was outside, it was near Prescott, Arizona, and some of these old timers that I haven't seen forever, and I thought there's a lot of milk and honey there. You know, they just love each other, and you know they're older now in their 70s, and going to squeeze the most they can out of the rest of the years that God might give them. And then the next day I went back to my first church. If you get the spirit, you saw the Selbo spirit, some of the pictures. The first church I served was American Lutheran in Prescott. It is like this church, a fabulous church. Now, bigger, we grew so much we relocated, but I'd forgotten how beautiful the building was. This beautiful stained glass in the front. They have 4 worship services. I think they still get over 500 people. When I left, they were up to 600 a Sunday, which was pretty amazing. But kind of the love that I had there from people, there were 60 or so who gathered in between all these services and just to say hi because it was their 75th anniversary. And I'd come on their 30th exactly. The bishop was there. They're celebrating 30 years, the balloons. I left on their 40th. Now it's 75th. How do these years go by, right? So we're up to, do the math here, John, about 120 this year, I think. It's hard to believe. But when I think about the theme of milk and honey, and I thought about that church, most of the things that people told me and thanked me about, I had forgotten. John, I don't know if you remember, but back then you helped my son. In one case, there had been a suicide of a teenager, a marital thing, a this and a that, and it's just like, it reminded me that a lot of what we do in life, this isn't just the pasture, but a lot of what we do in life, we may forget, but if we're living godly lives, if we're following the teachings of Jesus, just by the very fact that we're in God, we wake up in prayer, just our very essence, we're going to do things for other people that we're not going to think about. We're not going to pat ourselves on the back because we don't even know we're doing it. It's just who we are when Christ is in our heart. And I thought, what a refreshing thing for me as an older guy now, to think back then when I was, 28 to 38, those were the years that I was there, was able to help and also to buy land and build this beautiful church. A friend of mine wrote me, and you talk about milk and honey, we had our first worship service on the land. There was no building there. We just bought the land. So we had an early sunrise service, and I baptized one of the council members' sons. He still thanks me. He says, yeah, Pastor Johnny, put the baptismal water in a thermos so it wouldn't be cold. Because Prescott, Arizona, up at 5,000 feet at Easter, it's cold. It's like here, So I did that baptism, and it wasn't a big crowd, maybe 80 or so of us around this early morning sunrise service. And when it was over, at the high school, which is half a mile away, all of a sudden these hot air balloons just ascended into heaven. It was like magic. They all thought I planned that, which I had nothing to do with, but it's like, yeah, okay, I'll take that one. But I thought about milk and honey and the little things in life, just a little baptism. And this young boy now, of course, is, 35 years old or whatever, 40. And life goes on. And I just close with a personal thing that it just made me feel how important what we do here is, and it is to me. And I felt grateful. Some people were surprised I was still at it. I heard one guy, it was a contemporary service, so it was, the band up there and praising the Lord. And so it was my turn to go up there. I'm kind of excited. I kind of walked up there, and I heard somebody say, well, he sure gets around pretty good for an older guy. I pretended I didn't hear it. I'll take that one. I just biked to Key West. No, I didn't tell him that. But the milk and honey is just knowing that as we're people of God, we're just like the people in the wilderness. We follow God. We follow His ways. We're okay. Does that mean everything's going to work out? No. But even if it doesn't work out, we know God's going to bless us in that time. But when we are disobedient, that's when we get into trouble. And I'm going to close with this kind of a quote that you've heard and I've shared before. See if you think of who said it. This is about this country. We have been recipient of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied, enriched, and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with broken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and persevering grace, too proud to pray to God that made us. Any idea who gave that speech? Abraham Lincoln, back in the 1860s. And I think those words speak to us today. For our nation, when we turn from God, When we think we are God, we're in trouble. I don't care what side of the political aisle you're on. You think you're God, you're in trouble. You're going to be in the wilderness, never going to get to the promised land. So my prayer is that whatever time I have, and God give me good health, hopefully a long time, we can persevere. We can see we're surrounded by milk and honey, good things, and we celebrate quilts. We celebrate the children. We celebrate Bible school. We celebrate ministry. And together we grow in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.